everyone, and welcome to Walking Through the Bible. We all love to talk. Maybe some of us a bit too much. But whether it's in pleasant conversation, heated debate, or just to give our opinion, we all love to be able to speak. In fact, we love to speak so much that many Western cultures contain in their Constitution and Bills of Rights the freedom of speech. But have you ever considered that there might be a time when we just shouldn't speak? When us speaking might actually lead to sin, either in us or in others? In Psalm 39, David is facing a time of physical struggle, and yet he says that for a time he was silent. He was silent in blaming God for his suffering, and he was silent in vindicating God for God's righteousness in allowing suffering. Why? Let's find out. So if you have a Bible with you, turn to the book of Psalms, to Psalms 39. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 6. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Psalm 39, beginning at verse 1. To the chief musician, to Jeduthun, a psalm of David. I said, I will guard my ways, lest I sin with my tongue. I will restrain my mouth with a muzzle, while the wicked are before me. I was mute with silence. I held my peace even from good, and my sorrow was stirred up. My heart was hot within me. While I was musing, the fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue, Lord, make me to know my end, and what is the measure of my days, that I may know how frail I am. Indeed, you have made my days as handbreadths, and my age is as nothing before you. Certainly every man at his best state is but vapor. Surely every man walks about like a shadow. Surely they busy themselves in vain. He heaps up riches and does not know who will gather them. This psalm purports to be a psalm of David, and we see no real reason to dispute that. It is written to the chief musician, who at that time was a man named Jeduthun. If you ever wonder why did we study 1st and 2nd Chronicles and not just overview them? Weren't they just, after all, a Reader's Digest account of Genesis through 2nd Kings? And if you studied along with us, you'd know that that wasn't the case in what was presented narratively, but you'd also know that we met people in 1st and 2nd Chronicles that were not mentioned in the history that preceded it, men like Jeduthun. If we go back to 1 Chronicles chapter 25, verse 1 says this. Moreover, David and the captains of the army separated from the service son of the sons of Asaph, of Heman, and of Jeduthun, who should prophesy with harps, stringed instruments, and cymbals. Jeduthun was one of the members of the family selected in the temple as singers, ones who would prophesy with instruments of music. And the Psalms are the inspired poetry that they would sing. So it's no wonder that Psalm 39 should be addressed to Jeduthun, for he was one of the singers, and at the time of writing occupied the role of chief musician. As to when in David's life this referred to, we cannot be certain. However, his thoughts about the fleeting nature of life, and yet wanting to know his future, sound like the words of a young man looking forward, but not an old man looking back. And so it is likely that this psalm refers to an event that occurred earlier in David's life, but perhaps the psalm was written a little later. The psalm begins by saying that David guards his ways lest he sin with his tongue while the wicked are before him. Later on in the psalm, we'll find that David is suffering some physical ailment that could lead to complaint, and so actively guarding his tongue against railing against God was not only good for David, but it wouldn't allow the enemies of God the chance to blaspheme. And that's an apt lesson for us. Things happen to us that sometimes cause us to complain. Sometimes these complaints might be warranted and not sinful, but if we're not careful, these complaints can easily become sinful, especially if we attack the character of God in the process. Doing this privately would be bad enough, but airing these grievances publicly could cost others their soul in the process, for it could very well lead faithful people away from God and lead faithless people further away from God, never to return. Our words are powerful. Let's never doubt that. But the words of the righteous are always under scrutiny by the unrighteous, looking for anything with which the righteous can be accused. God could be mocked, or the wicked justified in their evil deeds. David didn't want that. He didn't want to give the wicked an opening. He went so far as to not even try to vindicate God's righteousness in the process, something that would have been good, but for the wicked, may not have helped them come to God because they don't see suffering the way Christians do. The wicked see suffering as God not stepping in and acting lovingly towards his creation, while the righteous see suffering as the results of sin being used by God, either directly or indirectly, to punish the wicked, but also to test and strengthen the faith of the righteous. Vindicating the righteousness of God is good. Not blaming God for evil is good. But doing so in front of the right audience is also good. For there's always good ways to say something. And in his suffering, David obviously didn't think he was in the right frame of mind to speak wisely. However, like it sometimes gets with us, we can only keep silent for so long before we just have to speak. So he cries out to the Lord for answers. Answers that he is not entitled to, but answers that he asks for nonetheless. David desires to know what the end of his days would be like. In other words, he wants to know if his suffering would ever end. He understands that life is frail and that age is nothing to God, for men could die old or young. But in comparison to eternity, even the lives of the old are like vapor or a shadow, who appear for a time and then vanish away. The fragility of life really should put things into perspective for us. For when you consider the lives of most people, once we become an adult, we work hard with the hopes of becoming rich enough to be able to retire. But in the end, if we succeed in this, we don't get to take those riches with us. So was there any real value to our work? Now, don't get me wrong. We are told to work with our hands in order to eat, and there is nothing necessarily wrong with becoming rich. But since we won't be taking our riches with us when we die, it is much more important that we become rich towards God and walk faithfully, so that our life after death, which will not be like a shadow but will be eternal, will be in God's presence and thus be abundant, and not away from God's presence and thus be desolate. David wanted to know his future about his future in terms of suffering, and in and of itself we can sympathize with him, for none of us like to suffer. But again, it was not an answer that David was entitled to. God could choose to tell him, but God didn't have to. So after having made this complaint, having acknowledged about the fragility of life, what would David say afterwards? And what he did say afterwards will define whether David's thoughts are acceptable before God or veered off into the very speech that David was speaking of remaining silent about. We hope you'll join us for the next lesson, where we will learn the answer to that. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Psalm 39, verses 7 to 13, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
We thank you for watching Walking Through the Bible today. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. But if you like this video, we ask that you consider subscribing to our channel so you won't miss out on other videos in our series, as well as share this video among your friends so that the saving message of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.